In reality, every reader is, while he is reading, the reader of his own self. The writer's work is merely a kind of optical instrument. That's a quote from Marcel Proust, right smack in the middle of his behemoth of a novel, In Search of Lost Time, or alternatively translated from the French to Remembrance of Things Past. What can I say about this book that hasn't already been said? Perhaps the reason is selfish. I think I gain a lot from making these videos, actually. The process of scripting out a video and then recording it and hearing and feeling my concrete thoughts on the book gives me a deeper appreciation for the novels that I review. So I tend to review novels that I think are maybe worthwhile in that sense. It has taken me some time to fully process Proust. I'm excited to put it to bed for at least some time until I maybe reread Proust. So beyond the selfish, I do think I have in this video a distillation of all the important things I've learned about Proust and learned about myself while reading this book. I feel that there are some really great videos about Proust online, clearly, obviously, and I will point those out in this video. However, the videos didn't really scratch the itch that I wanted when I was reading this book, and so I hope to kind of fill the gap in that sense. One of my favorite things about booktube is that it is conversational. It feels like having a conversation with your friend about their favorite book, or a book that they might recommend to you. And for this reason, I often prefer booktube over critical works or theory about books. It's more empowering as well because each person can create this deep and personal and beautiful connection to the novel, right? And create their own meaning with the novel. And I think that is actually fairly Proustian. It ties back to the quote that I read in the beginning of this video, that every reader is the reader of their own self. So, while making this video, I have learned a lot more about myself and about Proust, and I hope I can also pass that on to you. This book gave me, beyond all things, a new understanding of how time and emotions work beyond my own preconceived notions. It really challenged my belief about a lot of human things, and it's just one of the most beautiful pieces I've ever read. So here's a quick outline for my non-spoiler review or analysis of Proust. This video is made for anyone that has wanted to read Proust or has already read Proust. So here's my outline. So first I'm going to give you guys some context about the book. It'll be very quick. I'll give you guys a travel guide. So how does one finish and complete Proust? I'll give you guys a note on the translation. That took me some time to figure out, and I'll tell you guys about that so I can save you guys some time. And then I'll give you guys a book or a volume ranking. Technically, this is all one book, and I will make the argument that it should be read as one book, but I'll still rank the different volumes within it because it's fun. I'll talk a little bit about Proust Fatigue. It's a real thing. It affects your reading. From here on out, you are very much a different reader once you read Proust. It changes your life as a reader, definitely, and your life in general, of course. And then I'll go over a thematic review of the book. I'll talk about love, I'll talk about habit, art, friendship, truth, and I'll talk about identity. All of these things are really important elements to the book. Now, if you've already read the book, maybe you want to just skip ahead to the thematic review, although I think I have some helpful things and some fun things in between. So there should be kind of chapters that you guys can click forward on. So, context, part 1. You wouldn't have clicked on this video if you didn't already know what Proust was about, or maybe why Proust is important. all I really knew going into the book was that it's an important piece, but I didn't really know much about the plot per se of the novel. I just knew that this is one of those deeply important novels that of all time, right? To prepare myself for reading, I watched some School of Life videos. It's a YouTube channel that I will recommend and link below. And then I jumped in. But yeah, so context, it's one of the most important books of all time. It was written by Marcel Proust. He's French. And in short, the plot is about a guy that wastes his entire life on all these different things, searching for maybe a deeper meaning, and then finding his purpose at the end. It's about how one finds purpose and makes meaning in this world. And in that sense, it's meant to be an instructive book. So my travel guide, how would I start reading Proust? Well, before you start reading it, I might recommend watching some of those School of Life videos. Once they start going into the plot in those videos, I might recommend skipping the rest of the video, but the intro parts of the of the School of Life books, the School of Life, videos are quite instructive and give you a good sense of thematically what Proust is about, and it gives you a little bit about the author's background and such. Now, the biggest challenge about reading Proust is perhaps its length, right? How do you get through such a behemoth of a book? It has some of the longest sentences in literature. It is quite an undertaking. You learn to kind of deal with the long sentences, and your mind adjusts to that. But you still need to tackle it, right? So my biggest piece of advice is to read a little each day. Turn this book into a habit. Don't set markers saying that I will read 50 pages each day. One page could be enough. One paragraph could be enough. And then you might get carried away. But have that low entry point so that you at least dive into the book and into the world. Otherwise, if you spend too long outside of the world of Proust, I wouldn't really worry about forgetting things. Memory and forgetting things play an important part in reading this book. But the kind of drive to complete it might falter. Right, I started reading the book. I'm going to read for 2 hours, and then I turned it into a chore. And yes, you are making a habit by at least reading a little bit each day. But I think the mindset of treating it more as a fun activity that doesn't have to hit a certain point makes it a little bit more fun to read. So this book, if you watch the School of Life videos or know a little bit about Proust, is largely about the ills and evils of habit. And so maybe it's ironic that you have to create a habit in order to finish this book. You have to read, I think, a little bit each day in order to actually get something or to actually finish this book. So for me, I had about 25 minutes on public transportation each direction from work, and that was my habit. And I would read at least that, and sometimes I'd be stirred to read more. But that was enough for me. I would also say that you should be prepared to read the first 2 books. A lot of people just read book number 1, and I think that you don't really get a good sense for Proust until you read book 2. If you're picking up Proust, you're already kind of partially dedicated to the fact that you're going to go in for the long haul. So at least read books 1 and 2, and I think that will give you enough motive to finish it. I actually did not like book 1, and I'll talk about that when I rank the books, but I fell in love with Proust when I got into book 2. If you're not sold on reading 2 volumes, I should say, of Proust, that I think that's going to be close to 2,000 pages or just under, just read Swan in Love. Swan in Love, let me just shake this guy out, comes Almost spilled my obligatory Proust tea that I feel like I have to sip while I make this video. Okay, the tea is saved. Swan in Love, it comes actually in the middle part of Swan's Way. So this is the first volume. Each volume is broken into separate sections as well. So after you finish Cambrai, which is part 1 of volume 1, you can get to Swan in Love. It's the only time where the narrator is not the main voice. It switches perspectives for this. And in that way, part 2, which comes in at page 265 and is maybe 100 or 200 pages, so it's not long, works as a story by itself. We get a story about Swan, who is a very important character throughout the novel, but you get a beginning, middle, and end in this middle section. In English courses, they often treat this as a novella. Sometimes it's even sold as a novella, and they just study Swan in Love. So if you want to get a taste of Proust without, you want to read 200 pages before you dedicate yourself to reading, I forget how many thousand pages this book is, 4,000 maybe, just under, then start with those 200 pages. Swan in Love is an excellent book, and it reads, it's really fun. It's really, really fun. So maybe just skip the Cambrai section because it is a little hard to read at times, I would say. So book 1 really works as just kind of an overture. It introduces a lot of themes. It feels kaleidoscopic. You get introduced to a ton of characters, but you're not really sure why they're important or why these themes are important until you really get into book 2. And book 2 is really just a more straightforward story. Yes, it deals with all these complexities of life, but it's you understand what Proust is trying to do at this point. So I would recommend doing that. Okay. Book 2 is also the book that made Proust famous in his lifetime. He wasn't as well received with book 1, but when book 2 came out, he won some national awards, and people actually started to read him. So I would recommend following the course of history. People read until book 2 to get really into Proust. So how did I read this book? Maybe this will be instructive to you as well. I read book 1 and I put it down for some time. I thought I was going to be done with book 1 and just leave it, but something kept gnawing at me. I'm not really sure what that was, but I eventually came back to Proust. I went back and I read, the graphic novel. I'm just going to spill everything. This is actually the graphic novel of volume 2, but I read the graphic novel of volume 1, which I think is actually a really good summary of the book. So I needed to do some review because I definitely grazed over some sections of volume 1 because I just wasn't that into it. And so the graphic novel was a quick way to kind of go over the most important parts and help me get the characters straight. After I finished that graphic novel, I picked up book 2 and I just swam through that. It was just so much fun to read. I was taking so many notes, and I couldn't really put it down. I then picked up book 3, which was a lot tougher to read. This is called The Grammont Way. And book 3 is the longest single volume, and it's just pretty slow. So I would say book 1 and book 3 are maybe the hardest to kind of get through. Then I did a reader's guide. I picked up one of these reader's guides, and it gives me kind of a good in-depth analysis of each volume. So I did that as a review because I wanted to review books 1, 2, and 3 before jumping even further into the book. Book 4 is just as fun as book 2. I swam through that, and all of the rest of the books are incredibly fun from that point, and a lot faster to go through. It actually wasn't until the end of the novel that I actually went into the historical context. I wish I had done this a little bit earlier in the book. I think this actually naturally transitions into my ranking of the books, and then I'll go back into some more of my travel guide. So yeah, I said book number 1. Sorry, let's do this again. I would rank these books in this order. My favorite volume in this section is actually Within a Budding Grove, Volume 2. I thought this one was just superb. After that, my next favorite was Sodom and Gomorrah, which is Volume 4. After that would be the very last volume, but it comes at a pretty close third place, Time Regained. Pretty close third place with the combined 2 volumes. Oftentimes they publish them together, The Captive and The Fugitive. All of those read really well. Second to last place, I would put The Grammont Way, which is excellent, but drags on at some point. And some people would disagree with me, but I really, Swan's Way, the first book, I slept on, and I would put in last place. So yeah, 1, get through it, plow through it. Number 2 is where it comes alive. Book 4 was actually the most controversial when it came out. It was the last novel to come out. This is Sodom and Gomorrah. Now I have them all out of order, which is great. Love that. Lost it. There it is. This was the most controversial when it came out, Sodom and Gomorrah. And it's the last complete novel and the last novel, and the last novel that came out while Proust was alive. Proust was unable to fully edit the last few books, and you'll see that there are some errors in them. It still does feel like a very, very much a complete story, but there are some issues with like a character that might die and then somehow come back. There are some plot holes, but the real purpose of Proust is, I don't think the messaging gets affected in any way, and I think you can get a lot out of the last 3 volumes, 5, 6, and 7, even with those errors, right? Those errors are not that distracting. It's pretty controversial for the time, not now, Volume 4, because something is revealed. This is a non-spoilery version in the first few pages of it about one of the major characters, and then slowly throughout the rest of the book, a lot of the characters, not most, but a lot, also share that same trait. 5 and 6, while I was reviewing all of these, this is The Captive and The Fugitive. It's often just published together. But Volume 5 and 6 was the book or the volumes that I took the most notes in. I think this is where the messaging that Proust had was at its most concrete. And the section I remember the most vividly comes from this book. There was this kind of whiplash feeling I got when I, without spoiling it, learn some things about Albertine, about who she really is. And the amount of times reality, quote unquote, shifts in this part really hammers away at the major themes Proust is trying to get through with this book. And it's also just really fun. It really messed with me while reading. And then the last book is called Time Regained. And this is where the narrator finds his purpose, and that's in creating art. That's not really a spoiler, that's coming. And it has some beautiful reflections on the nature of time and the nature of death. Okay, so that's how I read it. Those were my rankings. There are some supplements I could recommend to you. The biggest hurdles are the length, and I said just read a little bit each day, create a habit out of it, and the mass amount of characters. There's well over 1,000 characters in this, and some characters have multiple names, and some characters have the same names, and it becomes very confusing. Some characters switch names and now have the name that someone else has, and that becomes very confusing. In reality, you only really have to keep track of 20 important characters, 20-ish. So find a good kind of character guide to help you out. The best one that I found was actually in the graphic novel. At the very end of it, they have a character tree and also a character map of all the different people and kind of an image that kind of helps you with that. There are some spoilers in the back here, but nothing real, like I would say major. Yeah. Okay. So I would recommend a good character list. That would help a ton. The supplemental books, the studies that I picked up and that were, through my research found to be some of the better ones, was the Cambridge In Search of Lost Time by David Ellison. I'll link it below. I found this to be a really good analysis of each section. It's not summary based, it's an analysis of each volume. So this might be good for someone that wants to read a volume and then go over the analysis of just that section. And so I did this piece by piece while reading it, or if you haven't read it in some time and you just want to go through the kind of analysis of it. It is not something that you should really read before going in. I also liked the Marcel Proust's Search for Lost Time, a reader's guide by Patrick Alexander. I thought this was pretty excellent, but it has a ton of spoilers. The character lists in here kind of ruin some major plot points. I don't believe in spoilers, but I also think this book works better if you don't know what's going to happen. So there's that. So this might be a good thing to review after you finish the entire thing. And it has a really good character guide and a guide of the major themes and elements and topics in this book, but it does spoil a lot, okay? And then, actually, I did lie. My first introduction to Proust was actually reading Alain de Botton's How Proust Can Change Your Life. This was a bestseller when it came out, I think in the early 2000s. And yeah, this was an excellent read. I read this, actually 1997 is when it came out. It's a series of essays where this author talks about how the book changed his life and how we can use it as instructive in our life. It's a intellectual self-help book. It's a self-help book based off Proust. You don't have to read this. It's a fun thing. If you know someone that likes Proust, this is a good Christmas gift for them. And this is, yeah, like I said, the same guy that does the School of Life channel is the same guy that wrote this. So there's going to be some overlap with that. Okay, so those are the supplements for this. And let's talk briefly about Proust Fatigue, and then we'll get into the major themes. All right. So yeah, I finished this book. I wanted to finish it before hitting this milestone, before turning 30. I narrowly missed it, which is okay. And then it took me a long time to kind of process it. I think I finished this incomplete novel about 6 months ago, so it feels kind of weird to return back to it, but I'm remembering all the things I loved about it right now, so that's really fun for me. And actually the process of getting through it was actually fairly slow, which, if you're going to read this, be kind to yourself. You don't have to finish this. But the Proust Fatigue I'm kind of referring to is, after I finished this book, I felt this strong urge to read a bunch of small novels, because I was like, nothing's gonna really scratch that same itch the way Proust did. If I read a long novel right now, I'm not going to, it's just not going to compare. So why should I even bother with that? And so I tried reading a bunch of short novels, and I did, but I just wasn't into it. And I realized I was lying to myself. It was just all reading after Proust seemed to pale in comparison. I'm just starting to get out of that Proust fatigue, which I'm excited about. It's nice to be excited about reading again. That was something I was not expecting after reading this book. This book is so masterful. It has so many strengths that it felt like I couldn't match it ever in my life again. I felt that already. I can't feel it again. But that feeling's starting to come back, and yeah, I don't know if you can relate to that. Please help me feel less alone in that thought. It was weird as someone that likes to read so much to feel that way. Felt strange. Okay, so that's my kind of overview. Let's talk about the themes of Proust. We're going to talk about love, time, friendship, memory, art, habit, and this book has shaken my understanding of all of those things. In short, I mean, just based off time and memory, Proust talks about how meaning changes over your life. That actually, every time you remember something, it's an act of creating because you're not actually remembering it the way it actually unfolded. Every time you remember something, you create something new. So I might remember this amazing experience from yesterday. Let's say yesterday I fell in love, which is not true. I've been in love and married for a while now, but let's say yesterday I fell in love and I'm remembering it, and I bring up these details about that day and about that experience. Now, let's say 10 years from now, I'm remembering that same thing. I'm not going to remember it the exact same. There are going to be details that are taken out and that are filled in. And so remembering is actually an artistic act of expression. And this is something that Proust goes back to over and over again. And he thinks it's actually good to remember. He thinks the ideal will always be better than the reality. So the memory will always be better than actually falling in love. Remembering that experience might be better. And in a lot of ways, Proust is the opposite of this Buddhist or meditative thought, which tells you to be present. Be present in your thoughts and in your emotions. Proust says, don't be present, be past. Right? Live in the past. That's okay. Because living in the past, while you do that, you are becoming an artist and you are expressing yourself. So we'll talk more about this, but first I want to talk about some of the more confrontational parts of this book for me, or parts that I disagreed with, at least at first. I think it's a good thing to read things that you disagree with and that challenge you. That might be obvious to people. I hope that's obvious to most of you. I remember when I read Nietzsche and I very much hated him. And there are some things about Proust that I very much disliked, but he challenged me. Proust's understanding of love and friendship, those are the first two things I'll talk about, are frankly abrasive, depressing, and beautiful. And so let's talk about that. Love. The ideal form of love for Proust is jealous love. More on that in a bit, but I want to read a quick quote from the second volume, which was my favorite. And in this, he talks about love as a destructive act. It's actually something that kind of destroys itself. This is found on page 139. Besides, it was she whom I loved and whom I could not therefore see without the anxiety, without the desire for something more, which destroys in us the presence of the person we love, the sensation of loving. End quote. So in that quote, ironically, the idea of loving someone actually creates this anxiety, which takes away that desire, and by taking away that desire, it destroys love. So love in a way destroys itself. Also, when you love someone, you learn more about them, and the mystery of them also starts to disappear. And for Proust, the ideal, we'll go back to it, the ideal is always better than the reality. So if you know the person, you know their reality, they become less interesting. Your mind doesn't fill in the blanks as much. So how do you keep love alive according to Proust? He says jealousy. Love to Proust is at its strongest when it's being removed or when it's being threatened. And the more you love someone, as I was saying earlier, the more you know them and the less mysterious. But if you become jealous, it puts in a little bit more. Sorry, it allows your brain to re-enter the area of mystery in that relationship, and your brain starts to create again and to become more artistic and to desire again. And so, with that mystery caused by jealousy, you become more of an artist and you create more. And so, Proust maybe advocates for this. If you want someone to love you, or if you want to love someone, there needs to be that element of jealousy in there. Okay. And for this, Proust is maybe controversial, but it is his theory of love that people remember Proust the most for. Proust also talks about emotions a lot, other than love. And he's masterful at showing us the bounds of language when it comes to describing emotions. Overall, he describes emotions as being incredibly complex, right? Love isn't love every time you say it. What I mean by that is, if I tell my wife that I love her this morning, I might mean one thing. If I text her I love her in the middle of the day, I might mean a different version of love at that point. And then when I come back from work, I might say it again and mean something else. 10 years from now, I might say love, I love you, to my wife. And that might mean something even different than all those other versions I just talked about. And so this word is actually a pretty poor container for the emotion of love, right? And language, therefore, is very limited in describing how we feel. A single feeling is often made up of contrary elements, Proust says. And I find that to be both depressing and beautiful, which is a pretty Proustian thing to say in response, right? To have two conflicting emotions at the same time, this kind of unique conflation that creates a unique emotion beyond language, right? I have different amounts of depressing and beautiful kind of mixed into this emotion as a response to Proust's take on love. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about friendship. In short, Proust says, don't waste your time on friendship. He thinks people are just using each other, and this was a particularly hard thing for me to read. I'm someone that very much values his friendships and takes them, takes a lot of stake and importance into the friendships that I've built. And this very much challenged my conception or my reality of how I view friendship, which I think is a healthy thing. The main art form for friendship is what? According to Proust, it's conversation. And conversation and friendship can actually be fatal to Proust. Because in both of those things, you lose yourself by becoming more like someone else. So you become less authentic and less like yourself in friendship and in conversation. He thinks conversation is hollow and gives us nothing. In conversation, the only thing that you pick up is other people's language, other people's slang and borrowed phrases. You often do this to sound cool, but it takes you away from the reality of who you are. It's a distraction. And we actually see this throughout all of the volumes, how different characters are trying to use the cutting edge slang to sound cool, and how certain phrases time out and become less cool later on. And part of me wishes that I spoke French fluently, because I think this book would have obviously a lot more power when talking about language and how language changes over time and phrases change over time if you read it in the original French. But the translation for this, I think, does a really solid job of trying to get those details in there. The kind of foil to Proust's argument on friendship is his character, Robert St. Loup. Robert is the narrator's best friend, and some of the most beautiful moments are the moments of pure friendship between Robert and the narrator. Robert takes great care of the narrator, and really challenges the main argument here about the limits of friendship. There is something at the very end, I think it's in the last volume or the last 2 volumes, where something is revealed about Robert that, since learning that, the narrator questions everything that Robert had done, and I just think that is it's a poor reason to think someone's not your friend or a bad friend, so to speak. But that's Proust's maybe argument. Friendship, like memories, are very fluid and change over time. They become weaker and stronger, and they exist mostly internally. Proust is a great social commentator. He talks about parties and how parties and social groups, we follow different social circles throughout this novel. Social circles and parties become more important based off not who they invite, but who they don't invite. How exclusive a party is more valuable than who's invited. And I think that's a pretty fun social commentary that definitely exists today. I love this quote. This is from volume 5, actually volume 6. It's from The Fugitive, right here. And it's on page 607 of this version. And he says this: "The bonds between ourselves and another person exist only in our minds, an illusion by which we want to be duped. In reality, we exist alone. Man is the creature who cannot escape from himself, who knows other people only in himself, and when he asserts the contrary, he is lying." So according to Proust, when you're around friends or different social groups, you lose the self. You lie to yourself and say, and identify in a different way. So it pulls you out of that, right? In reality, we are alone, and we want to maybe see ourselves in these friendship circles or whatnot, but according to Proust, those are all just distractions. All right, let's see. Proust's, one of his most brutal moments comes, I think, in the last volume on page 425. And he says, "For every death is, for the others, a simplification of life." So when a friend dies, life becomes simpler. "It spares them the necessity of showing gratitude, the obligation of paying calls." And here, I think I need to disagree with Proust. One, that's a pretty brutal thing to say, and maybe it's true for some, or for some instances, right? But I also think in Proust's thesis of friendship, I think he's conflating social climbing with friendships, and that there is something more to be found in a friendship that can actually help or lead you towards discovery. And I think we see that in the character of Robert St. Loup, who helps the narrator find himself, or helps the narrator become more comfortable with himself, at least. And all the other versions of friendship in this book are actually just moments of social climbing, and that is not true friendship. I think Proust would counter me and say all types of friendship are, in reality, ways to use someone, and therefore all friendship is social climbing. But we would have to agree to disagree at that point. All right. Next, I want to talk about identity. Proust's take on identity, I think, is quite beautiful and mind-bending. Just as love changes every time you say the word love, so does the word I. In reality, you are a series of different people. In the book, youth is idealized because within a young person, there is a strong potential for change, right? Going back to that kind of thing I said in the very beginning, the ideal is always better than the reality. So in a young person, there's so much potential for change, so many different ideal forms that exist, and therefore it's more beautiful. There are moments of the book that become really cringe when he talks about youth. And I think all writers that really idealize youth are problematic. I think Oscar Wilde can feel problematic in that sense, but that's my take. I think, yeah, I want to talk more about identity, right? And so we change over time, and we're really multiple selves in one. Identity is fluid, and in many ways, people change in our notions of someone else, right? Proust says that person doesn't really exist to you, they only exist in your mind. So, his best friend he can't know fully, but he has a version of that person in his head. And that person might seem real, but that's not actually, that's the ideal version of that person, or a created version, but not the real one. Let me see if I can make this sound a little bit more concrete. So in volume 5, the main character says this: was not Francois, his kind of nursemaid caretaker, was not Francois contained within me, for the distinction between persons and their interactions barely exists. So you are actually a composite of all the people that surround you, and your identity is fluid, and sometimes you might be a little bit more Francois, sometimes you might be a little bit more Robert, or sometimes you might be a little bit more of your mom, and such. The book also kind of complicates this notion of identity with how names work and how language works. And so one character might change names, might inhabit someone else's honorific, Prince of Blank, right? So they have the same name, but they're completely different people. And yeah, so quite literally, you are becoming someone else, at least in name, right? All right, habit. I want to talk about habit, and then art, and then we'll kind of wrap things up. The School of Life videos really belabor the point on this, and I do think they make a solid argument. Essentially, by breaking habit, you are creating life. And Proust says that if you modify your habits in small ways, you make your life a little bit more poetic. The great enemy of this book is habit and time. Habit makes time move a little bit faster. But if you break habit, you slow time down. And so that is a great enemy, and the way that you counter it is with art. Proust says this about artists. He says all artists are neurotic. All creators are neurotic. This is the quote: everything we think of as great has come to us from neurotics. It is they, and they alone, who found religions and create great works of art. The world will never realize how much it owes to them and what they have suffered in order to bestow their gifts on it. This is from The Grammont Way, Volume 3, page 414. And Proust was a pretty neurotic person. The narrator is pretty neurotic. And through this maybe neurosis or this anxiety about life, you break habit and you create new things. That's his conception of it, at least. By breaking habit, it allows you to see life in, quote, the light of your desire, not as how experience has taught you. So experience over time teaches you that there are more efficient ways of going through life, and so you inhabit that, and therefore sometimes you do a lot of your life without thinking. You wake up, you have your routine, and time just kind of flies by, right? By breaking habits, by trying out new things, it's an artistic expression. It's an expression. It's a way of creating that allows you to inhabit your time better. Okay, and art. Art is the enemy of habit. Habit is the enemy of life. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Okay. In volume 5, Proust asks this. He says, are there other worlds more real than the waking world? This is page 156. About 50 pages later on 204 and 205, he says this, could life console me for the loss of art? Was there in art a more profound reality in which our true personality finds an expression that is not afforded it by the activities of life? For every great artist seems so different from the rest and gives us so strong that sensation of individuality for which we seek in vain in our everyday existence. So, what is he saying here? Art, or the ideal, is more real than reality. Reality is actually fake, right? It exists only internally, and if we recognize that reality is internal, then we should recognize that what you create is more real than what you think exists outside of you. So, always going back, right? With Proust, the ideal is always better than reality. The artistic expression, the memory, what you create is always going to be better and more real than that. What else did I want to say? So there's a few other things. Art is kind of this thing that gives life after death, that you can still live on in your art. That's mentioned a bunch in this book. He talks about how real life is variable. There's not one universe, but millions of universes. He says there's almost as many universes as numbers of human eyes and brains in existence that wake every morning. For the truth is so variable for each of us. He talks about suffering a bunch in this book, and how suffering is how you create art. You suffer, and therefore you see things. This is a quote from volume 6, page 304. Only while we are suffering that we see certain things which at other times are hidden from us. So by suffering, it causes us to break habit, and then we start to create things, right? We create art through the suffering. So suffering, therefore, is a good thing. It gives us new eyes. I also like how suffering does not have to follow the notions of time either. There's a beautiful moment where someone dies, someone very important to the narrator dies. You know it's going to happen, and then it happens. And then it kind of just passes. It's actually in another volume, many years later, many hundreds of pages later, that the narrator starts to feel grief. And I love this non-chronological, or this outside the bounds of time, how grief works in this book. And that is perhaps maybe my second favorite part of the book, is when he is grieving and remembering way after that person had passed away. There's also some fun things about how travel, new modes of transportation and technology affect time. When Proust's narrator sees an airplane for the first time, he weeps. When he goes back to where he was as a child and travels there by car, he feels kind of cheated by the experience because it takes less time than by carriage, or less time than by walking. And so, yeah, there are really interesting interpretations of how travel and time affect each other. So those are my kind of thematic explorations with this book. I gained a lot from it. I hope you guys, also did. I did forget to talk about one thing. Where is it? So, I wanted to talk about the translations, and I've just strewn my notes all over the floor. There are kind of two major translations. The brand new translation that comes in this kind of version. A lot of people recommend reading Swan's Way as translated by Lydia Davis, and that's what I did. But I just didn't find it that engaging, and maybe that's a little bit of why I didn't like version 1. But the version of the novel that you should read, at least after that, and I would recommend from the beginning, is the C.K. Scott Moncrief and Terence Kilmartin version that's revised by D.J. Enright and introduced by Richard Howard. So there's a lot of people that worked on this, but all those names are important. The C.K. Scott Moncrief was the guy that originally translated Proust while he was still alive into English, and I think he works very close to the source. There are some artistic liberties that he took that are fairly controversial, and which are corrected by Kilmartin and Enright. And so this is the most complete version. It comes in a box set like this. I would highly recommend doing it that way. It just flows so much better, and it's one, even though it's 4 different people working on one book, it feels more like one voice. Lydia Davis does not translate the other versions. I think people like this because she is a famous author in her own right. She also translated Madame Bovary. But the rest of this updated Penguin collection, each volume is translated by a completely different person, and it has fairly mixed reviews. Okay, anyways, that's the end of my video. This is the longest video I've ever made. I hope you guys liked it. If you have any other travel tips for Proust, please put that in the comment below. What other books would you compare to the experience of reading Proust? Those kind of life-changing books. Are there any other books that kind of gave you how I described the Proust fatigue, where reading afterwards didn't seem as enjoyable because the book that you just finished was so good? Anyways, that's it. I'm Dimitri. Thanks for watching The Bookworm. Talk to you later.